They say the best place to hide a diamond is in a pile of glass. For 365 days, Elena was the glass. She was the girl who scrubbed the blood off the marble. She was the nothing that Lorenzo Volpe stepped over without a second glance. But tonight, the glass shattered. Tonight, the man who hunted her family for a decade, Lorenzo's greatest nightmare, didn't come here to kill her. He came to reclaim his crown. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. She looked at Lorenzo, the man who had humiliated her, the man who thought he owned her soul, and for the first time, she saw him tremble. Welcome back to Underworld Love Chapters, where the shadows always tell a story. Today, we bring you an epic tale of hidden bloodlines and the ultimate revenge. Please like, subscribe and comment and on the notification button for more stories. Let's get back to our story. In the city of Veranza, Lorenzo Volpe is the undisputed king. He is ruthless, arrogant, and convinced that everyone has a price. When he bought Elena from a bankrupt orphanage to serve as a low-level maid in his fortress, he thought he was simply adding another tool to his collection. He treated her with a cruelty that would break any ordinary woman. But Elena is anything but ordinary. She is the last of the Romanovs, the royal bloodline Lorenzo thought he had wiped out years ago. She has spent a year serving him his coffee, cleaning his guns, and listening to his darkest secrets. She was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment has finally arrived. Stick with us until the very end, because the way Elena uses her new power to dismantle Lorenzo's world is something you will never see coming. This is the Maid's final order. The transition from a princess to a ghost didn't happen overnight, it was a slow, agonizing descent into the shadows. My first day at the Volpe estate felt like walking into my own tomb, though the gold leaf on the ceilings and the scent of expensive cigars tried to convince me otherwise. I stood in the foyer, my small suitcase clutched in hands that used to play Rachmaninoff on a grand piano, now destined to scrub the grime from the corners of a monster's life. Lorenzo Volpe didn't greet me. He simply existed in the room, a predator who commanded the very air to go still. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to me, the silhouette of his broad shoulders casting a long, intimidating shadow across the floor. When he finally turned, his eyes weren't filled with the curiosity one might show a new employee. They were empty. To him, I was no different than the mahogany furniture or the silk drapes, a utility, a thing to be used until it wore out. The rules are simple, Elena, he said, his voice a smooth baritone that felt like velvet wrapped around a blade. You are not to be seen. You are not to be heard. You are to ensure that my world remains perfect, without ever leaving a footprint in it. Do you understand? I nodded, keeping my gaze fixed on his polished shoes. I could feel the weight of his stare, a physical pressure that made my skin crawl. He walked toward me, each step deliberate, until the tip of his chin was inches from the top of my head. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting my face upward. For a terrifying second, I thought he saw the defiance I was struggling to bury. I thought he saw the Romanov fire behind my blue eyes. Answer me when I speak to you, girl, he whispered, his grip tightening just enough to hurt. I understand, Mr. Volpe, I replied, my voice a practiced whisper of submission. He let go of me as if I were a piece of soiled linen. Good. If I find a single speck of dust, or if I hear your voice again without permission, you'll find out exactly how I deal with things that don't serve their purpose. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in humiliation. I was given a uniform that felt like a shroud, a stiff, gray dress and a white apron that marked me as a servant. My days began at 4 in the morning, long before the sun dared to touch the snow-capped peaks of the Alps. I learned the rhythm of his house, the way the floorboards groaned under his weight, and the way the air grew cold whenever his temper flared. I watched him. From the corners of the room, behind the steam of his morning espresso, I gathered the pieces of the man who had destroyed my life. I watched him order the deaths of rivals with the same casual tone he used to request more sugar. I watched him mock the weak, laughing as he crushed men who dared to ask for mercy. One afternoon, while I was polishing the silver in the dining room, Lorenzo entered with Bianca, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and artificial as a diamond. She looked at me and wrinkled her nose as if she'd smelled something rotting. "Lorenzo, darling, why do you keep this one?" Bianca asked, gesturing toward me with a manicured hand. "She looks like she's perpetually at a funeral. It's depressing." Lorenzo didn't even look at me. He was pouring a glass of wine, his movements fluid and precise. "She's efficient, Bianca. And she knows how to be silent. It's a rare quality in a woman." Bianca giggled, a shrill sound that set my teeth on edge. She walked over to me, her expensive perfume choking the air. "Is that so? Let's see how silent she is." She accidentally tipped her glass of red wine, the dark liquid splashing across my white apron and soaking through to my skin. "Oh, dear. I'm so clumsy. Clean it up, Maid." I felt the heat rising in my chest, a roar of ancestral pride that screamed at me to wrap my fingers around her throat. Instead, I dropped to my knees. I took a cloth from my belt and began to blot the wine from the floor. "Well?" Bianca prodded, stepping on my hand with the sharp heel of her stiletto. "Aren't you going to apologize for being in the way?" The pain was a sharp, white light in my brain, but I didn't make a sound. I looked up, not at her, but at Lorenzo. He was watching me over the rim of his glass. There was a flicker of something in his expression, not pity, never pity, but a dark, twisted curiosity. He wanted to see me break. He wanted to see the nothing cry out. "I'm sorry, miss," I said, the words tasting like ash. "See?" Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. Perfectly silent. But that night, in the small, cramped room in the servants' quarters, I stripped off the wine-stained apron and reached for the floorboard beneath my bed. I pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch. Inside was a locket, gold and worn, containing the crest of a family that had once ruled half the world. I clutched it to my chest, the cold metal biting into my palm. I wasn't just a maid. I was a ledger, and I was recording every debt Lorenzo Volpe owed me. Every insult, every bruise, every moment of forced silence was a line in a book that would eventually be closed in blood. I looked out the small, barred window at the distant city lights, knowing that somewhere out there, the remnants of my father's empire were searching for me. They thought I was dead. They thought the Romanov line had ended in a burning palace. They didn't know that their queen was currently scrubbing the floors of the man who had lit the match. I closed my eyes, the image of Lorenzo's arrogant face burned into my mind. He thought he was the hunter, but he had brought the predator into his own home. He had given me the keys to his kingdom, and he was too blinded by his own power to see the noose I was weaving for him, one silent day at a time. The atmosphere within the Volpe estate shifted from a cold stillness to a jagged, electric tension the moment the news broke of Victor Carlo's arrival. In the underworld, names were currency, and Victor's was minted in iron and blood. He was the only man who had ever looked Lorenzo in the eye without flinching, the only rival whose shadow loomed as large as the dawn's own. As a maid, I was expected to be a shadow, but as a Romanov, I felt the shift in the air like a change in the wind before a storm. Preparation for the peace summit turned the mansion into a frantic hive of activity. Lorenzo was on edge, his usual calculated arrogance sharpened into a volatile cruelty. I found myself working double shifts, my hands raw from the caustic cleaning agents used to polish the grand ballroom's chandeliers until they sparkled like frozen tears. I was moving through the hallway outside Lorenzo's study, carrying a heavy tray of crystal decanters, when I heard the heavy thud of the front doors. Victor Carlo didn't just walk into a room, he reclaimed it. I stood pressed against the wall, my head bowed as the procession of men moved past. I could smell the leather of their holsters and the sharp, metallic scent of the winter air clinging to their coats. Then, the footsteps stopped. The polished black boots of the man at the front came to a halt directly in front of mine. I didn't look up, but I felt a gaze so intense it seemed to burn through my thin cotton uniform. It wasn't the dismissive, cold stare Lorenzo gave me. This was a look of recognition, a haunting silence that stretched for a heartbeat too long. "Everything is in order, I hope?" Lorenzo's voice boomed from the top of the stairs, sounding forced and hollow. "Perfect order, Lorenzo," Victor replied. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and dangerous. "I see you've upgraded your staff. This one has an interesting grace." "She's a servant, Victor." "Don't waste your breath," Lorenzo snapped, descending the stairs with a territorial swagger. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of my bicep as he pulled me away. "Go to the kitchen. You're not needed here." I hurried away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Victor knew. He had to know. The way his breath hitched, the way he lingered on my presence, he had seen my mother's face in mine. But in this world, recognition was often a death sentence. The summit dinner was a theater of masks. I was tasked with serving the wine, moving like a ghost between men who discussed the price of lives over plates of Wagyu beef. Lorenzo was in rare form, drinking heavily and using every opportunity to exert his dominance. He wanted to show Victor that he was the master of everything within these walls, including me. "Elena," Lorenzo called out, his voice slurred but loud enough to command the room. I stepped forward, the heavy silver pitcher in my hands. "Our guest is thirsty. And since you're so fond of being silent, why don't you show him some of that lowly humility you've perfected?" He pointed to the floor. The cigar I dropped. "It's on the terrace. Go fetch it. Barefoot. I want you to feel the cold of the mountain air so you remember how lucky you are to have my roof over your head." The table went silent. Even the other capos looked away, embarrassed by the blatant pettiness of the command. The terrace was covered in a thin layer of frost, the stone floor biting and lethal in the midnight air. I didn't hesitate. To hesitate was to show weakness, and I was a Romanov. I stepped out of my simple black flats and walked toward the glass doors. The cold hit me like a physical blow, 1,000 needles pricking the soles of my feet. I could feel the eyes of the men behind the glass watching me. I found the cigar, its golden band glinting under the moon, and picked it up with a steady hand. My skin was turning a ghostly blue, and my breath hitched in the freezing wind, but I kept my spine straight. I wasn't a maid on that terrace, I was an empress in exile, walking through her own frozen kingdom. When I returned, my feet were numb and bleeding slightly from the jagged frost. I placed the cigar on a silver tray and presented it to Lorenzo. He smirked, looking at Victor for approval. "See? Better than a dog. She doesn't even bark." Victor's hand was wrapped around his wine glass so tightly the stem began to hairline fracture. His eyes were fixed on me, dark and unreadable. For a moment, our gazes locked, a silent scream passed between us. He wasn't looking at a maid. He was looking at a tragedy. Later that night, the house finally fell into an uneasy sleep. I slipped out to the garden to gather my thoughts, the moonlight silvering the rosebushes. I thought I was alone until a shadow detached itself from the stone archway. "How long have you been in this cage, little swan?" I froze. Only one person had ever called me that. My father, in the gardens of the palace, before the fire consumed it all. I turned to find Victor standing there, his coat open, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. "I don't know who you are talking to, sir," I whispered, though my voice trembled. Victor stepped into the light. He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a signet ring, the heavy, gold eagle of the Romanov syndicate. "Your father gave this to me when he thought the line was dead. He told me to find the girl with the blue fire in her eyes. I've spent 5 years looking for a ghost, only to find her scrubbing the floors of a dog like Volpe." "You shouldn't be here, Victor," I said, my voice finally firm. "If he finds us. If he finds us, I will tear his heart out through his ribs," Victor promised, his eyes flashing with a predatory hunger. "Give the word, Elena. The soldiers are waiting. They don't want a dawn, they want their queen. We can end this tonight." I looked back at the looming silhouette of the mansion, at the window where Lorenzo's lights still burned. A year of humiliation, a year of being treated like a piece of refuse, washed over me. But I didn't want a rescue. I didn't want to be saved by another man. "No," I said, my voice cold and sharp as the mountain ice. "Lorenzo doesn't get a quick death. He doesn't get the mercy of a bullet in the dark. He wants to see me as a maid. Then I will stay a maid, until the moment I take everything from him. Stay your hand, Victor. When the crown returns to my head, I want him to be the one who placed it there." Victor bowed his head, a gesture of submission that felt more powerful than any weapon. "As you wish, Your Majesty. But know this, the underworld is a tinderbox. And you are the match." I turned and walked back into the house, my bare, bruised feet leaving faint red marks on the marble. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was counting down. The night of the grand masquerade was not just a party, it was a funeral for the girl I had pretended to be. The Volpe estate was transformed into a gilded labyrinth of silk and secrets, filled with the elite of the underworld hiding behind masks of gold and velvet. Lorenzo had spent a fortune to ensure the world saw his dominance, but his ultimate display of power was saved for me. He had refused to let me wear the standard maid's attire. Instead, he had provided a costume that was a deliberate insult, a flimsy, lace-trimmed mockery of a servant's uniform, designed to make me feel exposed and small in a room full of giants. "Wear it," he had commanded, his eyes roaming over me with a possessive, cruel light. "I want them to see what I've tamed. I want everyone to know that even the most beautiful things in this house belong to my floor." As I moved through the ballroom with a silver tray of champagne, I was a ghost in a sea of monsters. The heavy scent of lilies and expensive perfume felt like a suffocal. I could hear the whispers of the capos as I passed, their eyes lingering on the stray Lorenzo had kept. I kept my chin tucked, my eyes on the bubbles in the crystal flutes, playing my part until the very last second. I saw Victor across the room, his face hidden behind a charcoal wolf mask. He didn't move. He stood like a statue of vengeance, his hand never straying far from the jacket where I knew his weapon rested. Lorenzo stood at the center of the room, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his lion mask pushed up to reveal his arrogant, flushed face. He was riding the high of a successful summit, feeling untouchable. He signaled for the music to stop, the sudden silence falling over the crowd like a heavy shroud. "Friends, allies, and rivals," Lorenzo announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed he was God. "Tonight is about legacy. Many have tried to challenge the Volpe name. Many have looked for the remnants of the old world, the Romanovs who once thought they ruled us. But look around you." He gestured toward me, snapping his fingers. "Come here, Elena." I walked into the center of the circle, the eyes of the underworld burning into my skin. Lorenzo wrapped a heavy, bruising arm around my shoulders, pulling me against his side. "The Romanovs are gone. They are ash and memory. And this This is all that's left of their prestige. A girl who scrubs my toilets. A girl who begs for my scraps. He laughed, and the room joined him, a chorus of hyenas mocking a fallen star. To the girl who knows her place. He raised his glass, and in that moment of absolute triumph, the massive oak doors of the ballroom didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. The sound was like a thunderclap. Victor's men flooded the room, but they didn't fire a single shot. They moved with a terrifying, silent precision, forming two lines that stretched from the door to the center of the dance floor. The guests scrambled back, guns being drawn and then slowly lowered as they realized they were surrounded by the Romanov syndicate's elite guard, men who had been disappeared for years, now standing tall in their black fatigues. Victor stepped forward, removing his wolf mask and dropping it to the floor. He didn't look at Lorenzo. He didn't look at the guns pointed at his heart. He walked straight into the center of the circle. Lorenzo tightened his grip on me, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and sudden, sharp fear. Victor. What is the meaning of this? This is a peace summit. Victor stopped 3 paces away. He looked at me, and for the first time in a year, I didn't look at the floor. I met his gaze, and the blue fire of my ancestors finally roared to life. With a slow, deliberate movement, Victor sank to one knee. He bowed his head, his forehead almost touching the marble I had spent months scrubbing. The sound of his knees hitting the floor was the loudest sound in the history of the Volpe estate. Your Majesty, Victor's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The wait is over. The army is at the gates, the traitors have been marked, and the throne is yours. Forgive my delay, Queen Elena. The tray in my hands didn't shake. I simply let it go. The crash of silver and glass against the marble sounded like music. Lorenzo's arm fell away from me as if he had been burned. He backed away, his face turning the color of ash. Queen? No, she's a maid. I bought her, she's nothing. I reached up and unzipped the back of the demeaning maid's dress, letting the gray fabric fall to the floor. Beneath it, I had spent weeks sewing a slip of midnight silk, hidden like a secret. I stood there, taller than I had ever been, the moonlight from the high windows catching the gold locket I had finally placed around my neck. You were half right, Lorenzo, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a guillotine. I did know my place. I knew it every time I watched you sleep and decided not to slit your throat. I knew it every time I cleaned your blood off the floor, knowing that one day, it would be yours that I was scrubbing away. I walked toward him, and for the first time, the great Lorenzo Volpe tripped over his own feet. He fell back into his gilded chair, the lion mask falling to the floor and shattering. I leaned down, my face inches from his. You wanted to show your guests what you tamed, I whispered, loud enough for every dawn in the room to hear. But you didn't tame a stray, Lorenzo. You gave your keys to the woman who owns your life. I looked at Victor, who remained on his knee, waiting for my command. The power in the room shifted so violently it felt like the floor was tilting. I wasn't the girl who missed a spot on the marble anymore. I was the woman who was about to repaint the city in the colors of my family's crest. Rise, Victor, I commanded. And secure my guest. He has a lot of scrubbing to do. As the guards closed in on a screaming Lorenzo, I turned my back on him. I walked through the lines of men bowing as I passed, stepping out of the house that had been my prison and into the night that was finally mine. The Romanovs hadn't returned with a whimper, we had returned with a crown. The silence that followed Lorenzo's removal was heavier than the noise of the party had ever been. I stood at the head of the grand staircase, the midnight silk of my gown catching the light of the chandeliers I had once polished with bleeding fingers. Below me, the elite of the underworld remained frozen, their masks no longer symbols of power, but of cowardice. They had all watched me scrub these floors, they had all laughed at Lorenzo's jokes. Now, they waited to see if I would be the kind of queen who offered mercy or the kind who demanded blood. Victor stood at the base of the stairs, his eyes never leaving mine. He was my sword, the iron fist of the Romanov legacy, but tonight, he was also the only witness to the toll this year had taken on my soul. He didn't ask for orders, he waited for my breath to steady. The Volpe Empire is forfeit, I said, my voice projecting through the hall with a clarity that surprised even me. Every contract, every territory, and every debt now belongs to the Romanov syndicate. If you serve Lorenzo, you have 1 hour to leave this city. If you stay, you swear fealty to the crown he tried to bury. One by one, the men who had looked through me for months lowered their heads. It was a wave of submission, a domino effect of terror and respect. I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline focus. Revenge was a dish best served cold, but leadership was a burden that never warmed. I walked down the stairs, each step a reclamation of my dignity. Victor met me at the bottom, offering his arm. As we walked through the foyer, past the spot where Bianca had crushed my hand with her heel, I saw her. She was huddled in the corner, her expensive mask discarded, her face streaked with mascara and genuine fear. I stopped in front of her. She looked up, her lips trembling, waiting for the blow. I reached out and took the glass of wine she was clutching with shaking hands. I looked at the dark liquid, then back at her. For a moment, the memory of the wine soaking into my skin, the stinging humiliation of the accident, flared in my mind. The wine is room temperature, Bianca, I said softly. A queen deserves better. I poured the liquid onto the floor, the very floor I knew every inch of, and handed her the empty glass. Clean it up. And make sure you don't miss a spot. I didn't stay to watch her drop to her knees. I didn't need to. The cycle of the mansion had been broken, and the ghosts of my ancestors were finally at peace. Victor led me out into the crisp night air, where a fleet of black SUVs waited, their engines humming like a purring beast. "Where to, Your Majesty?" Victor asked as he opened the door for me. I looked back at the Volpe estate, the lights still blazing, the silhouette of the fortress looking smaller than it ever had before. It was no longer a prison. It was just a house made of stone and stolen dreams. "To the north," I replied. "It's time to remind the world that the winter doesn't end just because the sun comes out. It ends when the Queen says it does." As the car pulled away, I leaned my head against the cool leather seat. The weight of the signet ring on my finger felt right. The girl who was a maid was gone, burned away in the fire of the masquerade. The woman who remained was something far more dangerous. I looked out at the passing trees, the mountains of my childhood rising in the distance, and for the first time in a year, I let myself smile. Lorenzo was in a cell, Bianca was on her knees, and the underworld was finally under my heel. The transition from the Volpe fortress to the Romanov stronghold was a journey through a landscape of shifting loyalties. As the motorcade carved through the mountain passes, the air grew thinner and colder, a familiar bite that tasted of home. Victor sat across from me in the darkened cabin of the SUV, his eyes reflecting the passing trees like a predator watching the forest. He remained silent, giving me the space to let the maid die and the monarch breathe. I watched my reflection in the window. The smudge of ash on my cheek from the gala's chaos was the only remnant of the girl who had spent a year in the dirt. I wiped it away with a silk handkerchief, and with it, the last of my mercy. We arrived at the Romanov citadel as the first light of dawn touched the peaks. The iron gates, heavy with the history of 1,000 years, groaned as they swung open. Men in tactical gear stood at attention, their breath misting in the air, their hands over their hearts. This was the army Victor had promised, the hidden remnants of my father's power, waiting for the spark to ignite the forge. The interior of the citadel was a sharp contrast to Lorenzo's gaudy display of wealth. Here, the walls were cold stone and dark oak, smelling of old parchment and gun oil. It was a place built for war, not for show. Victor led me to the war room, a circular chamber where a massive digital map of the city's underworld glowed in shades of amber and red. "The transition is nearly complete," Victor said, his voice dropping into a low, professional cadence. "The Volpe accounts have been frozen. His lieutenants are either in our custody or running for the borders. But there is a complication." He tapped a key, and an image flickered onto the screen. It was a photograph of a man I didn't recognize, younger than Lorenzo, with a scar that ran like a jagged lightning bolt from his temple to his jaw. He looked less like a businessman and more like a ghost. "Marco Volpe," I whispered, the name tasting like poison. "Lorenzo's younger brother. I thought he died in the purge 10 years ago." "He was the one who went into exile before you did," Victor explained. "He's been rebuilding in the East. And he's not coming for the money, Elena. He's coming for the blood. He's already made contact with the families who are hesitant to bow to a woman." I leaned over the table, my fingers tracing the glowing lines of the city's borders. The weight of the crown was already beginning to press against my temples. "He thinks because I was a maid, I am soft. He thinks I am a girl who got lucky with a strong protector." I looked up at Victor, my gaze as sharp as the mountain ice. "Let him come. Let him see that the year I spent at his brother's feet wasn't a sentence, it was an education." The following days were a blur of strategy and iron. I didn't just command, I inspected. I walked the barracks, I sat with the elders of the syndicate, and I personally oversaw the interrogation of Lorenzo's inner circle. Word reached us that Lorenzo was refusing to eat in his cell, still demanding to speak to the maid. He couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that the person who controlled his life was the same one who used to iron his shirts. One evening, I found myself back in the Citadel's library, a room that mirrored the one where Lorenzo had once pinned me against a desk. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in a high-backed leather chair when Victor entered, carrying a small wooden box. "Something was recovered from the Volpe vault," he said, placing the box on the table between us. I opened it. Inside was a stack of letters, tied with a fraying blue ribbon. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. As I read, the world seemed to tilt. These weren't business ledgers. They were letters addressed to Lorenzo's father, speaking of a pact, a marriage contract meant to unite the Romanovs and the Volpes decades ago. Lorenzo hadn't just been my tormentor, he had been my intended. He had known who I was from the moment I stepped into his foyer. He hadn't kept me as a maid because he was blind, he had kept me there to break the contract and my spirit simultaneously. A cold, hollow laugh escaped my lips. He knew, Victor. All that time, he knew exactly who I was. He wanted to see a Romanov queen beg for a crust of bread. Victor's face hardened, his jaw set in a line of pure fury. He should have been executed the night of the gala. "No," I said, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my velvet gown. "Death is too simple for a man who tries to steal a queen's soul. He wanted a maid? Then we shall give him a master." I walked to the window, looking out over the valley where the lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars. The war with Marco was coming, and the underworld was still trembling from the shock of my return. But I wasn't the scared girl in the gray apron anymore. I was the architect of a new era. "Prepare the men," I told Victor. "We move on the eastern docks tonight. If Marco wants a war, we will give him one that burns until the snow melts." "And Victor?" He paused at the door. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Send a message to Lorenzo's cell. Tell him I've found the contract. Tell him that tonight, I'm burning it. along with everything he ever loved. I turned back to the map, the red lights reflecting in my eyes. The chapters of the Maid were closed. The chapters of the Queen had just begun, and the ink would be written in the blood of those who dared to forget my name. The eastern docks smelled of salt, rotted timber, and the iron tang of impending violence. It was a place where the city's heart stopped beating and its darkest instincts took over. I stood on the edge of a rusted shipping container, the wind whipping my heavy wool coat around my ankles, watching the shadows dance under the flickering amber streetlights. Beside me, Victor was a silhouette of lethal intent, his hand resting on the radio at his chest. We were no longer in the gilded halls of a mansion or the cold stone of a citadel, we were in the trenches of the underworld, and the air was thick with the scent of the hunt. Marco Volpe had chosen his ground well. The docks were a labyrinth of steel and fog, a maze that favored the desperate. He thought that by striking here, at our most vulnerable supply line, he could prove that a Maid had no business commanding a war. He wanted to bleed my resources before I could even solidify my throne. He didn't realize that I had spent a year learning how to navigate the dark corners of a house owned by a monster. I knew how to move without making a sound. I knew how to wait. "They're moving, Your Majesty," Victor whispered, the static of the radio chirping in the silence. 3 squads. "They're heading for the warehouse containing the northern shipments." "Let them get inside," I replied, my voice as steady as the tide. "I want them to feel the weight of what they're trying to steal before we close the doors." We moved through the shipyard like ghosts. My boots, once accustomed to the soft carpet of Lorenzo's study, now crunched over gravel and glass with a rhythmic precision. Every step felt like a heartbeat of the Romanov line returning to the earth. We reached the warehouse just as the sound of breaking iron echoed through the night. Marco's men were inside, their flashlights cutting through the dark like frantic eyes. I stepped into the light of the main entrance, the heavy steel door groaning as Victor pushed it wide. The men inside spun around, their weapons raised, but they froze the moment they saw me. I wasn't wearing a crown of gold, but the way the moonlight hit my face, the absolute lack of fear in my expression, commanded a silence that no bullet could achieve. "You're looking for the Romanov Queen," I said, my voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "Here I am. But you seem to have forgotten that a queen never travels alone." On cue, red laser sights bloomed on their chests like a sudden breakout of fever. My snipers were in the rafters, silent and invisible. The men dropped their weapons, the clatter of steel against concrete sounding like the tolling of a bell. Out of the shadows at the back of the room, Marco Volpe finally emerged. The scar on his face looked like a jagged white worm in the harsh light of the warehouse. He didn't look like a Don, he looked like a man who had spent too much time living in his brother's shadow. "You have a lot of nerve, Elena," Marco sneered, though his hand was visibly trembling as he reached for his holster. "Lorenzo was a fool to let you live. He thought he could break you, but all he did was sharpen you. I won't make the same mistake." "Lorenzo's mistake wasn't letting me live, Marco," I said, taking a slow step toward him. "His mistake was thinking that power is something you can own. Power is something you are." I signaled to Victor. With a swift movement, he brought forward a small, battered metal box, the same one that had held the letters in the library. I reached inside and pulled out a single piece of parchment, the marriage contract that had sparked this entire tragedy. "Your brother spent a year trying to turn me into a servant to avoid this," I said, holding the paper up. "He thought if he broke the woman, he could break the pact. But he forgot one thing." I pulled a lighter from my pocket, the flame dancing in the drafty room. "A queen doesn't need a contract to rule. She just needs the will to burn the old world down." I touched the flame to the corner of the parchment. We watched in silence as the ink and the names of our fathers turned into orange embers and drifted toward the ceiling. The bridge between the Volpes and the Romanovs didn't just break, it evaporated. Marco lunged, a desperate, final act of a dying dynasty, but Victor was faster. A single, muffled shot echoed through the warehouse, and Marco fell to his knees, clutching a wound in his shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the realization that the Maid was capable of far more than just silence. "Take him to the Citadel," I told Victor, not even looking back as I walked toward the exit. "Put him in the cell next to his brother. Let them discuss their failures in the dark." I stepped back out into the night air, the salt spray of the ocean hitting my face. The war wasn't over, there would always be another Marco, another Lorenzo, another shadow waiting to strike. But as I looked out at the black expanse of the sea, I realized that the fear I had carried for so long was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, iron certainty. I was no longer the girl who was forced to choose between a maid's apron and a queen's crown. I had forged my own path, and the underworld was finally learning to walk it with me. The chapters of my life were no longer being written by men who thought they owned me. I held the pen now, and the story I was writing was going to be a masterpiece of fire and blood. "Is that all, Your Majesty?" Victor asked, appearing at my side. "For tonight, Victor," I said, looking up at the stars. "For tonight, the Queen is going to rest. Tomorrow, we remind the rest of the city why they used to fear the winter." The victory at the docks had settled the dust of war, but the silence that followed was far more treacherous. I sat in the high-backed chair of my father's study, the scent of old paper and beeswax grounding me in a world that still felt like a dream I might wake from at any moment. The transition of power was a surgical process, precise, cold, and bloody. My days were no longer measured by the number of rooms I had to scrub, but by the number of lives I held in the palm of my hand. Victor entered the room without knocking, a privilege earned by a decade of loyalty that had never wavered, even when I was a ghost. He placed a folder on my desk, its edges frayed. "The final transition of the Volpe assets is complete, Elena. But there is one last piece of the past that refuses to be buried." I looked up, the glow of the desk lamp casting sharp shadows across my face. "Lorenzo?" "He has stopped asking for the Maid," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave. "He is asking for his wife. He claims the contract we burned was a copy, that the original is held by a third party, a neutral mediator who will come to collect the debt if he is not released." I felt a cold prickle of irritation at the back of my neck. Lorenzo was like a parasite that refused to let go of the host, even as the host began to thrive. I stood up, smoothing the dark silk of my trousers, and walked toward the window. The city below was a tapestry of amber lights, a kingdom that was finally beginning to breathe under my rule. "He's bluffing, Victor. He's a man drowning in his own hubris, reaching for any straw that might keep his head above water." "Perhaps," Victor replied, stepping closer. "But in our world, a bluff is often just a truth that hasn't been fired yet. If there is a mediator, it's likely the Council of Shadows. If they get involved, this stops being a family feud and starts being an international incident." I turned back to him, the blue fire in my eyes reflecting the digital maps on the wall. "Then we don't wait for them to knock. We find the mediator first. If Lorenzo has a secret ally, I want their name, their location, and their price before the sun sets." I spent the next several hours descending into the belly of the Citadel, the high-security wing where the air was stagnant and smelled of damp stone. The guard stepped aside as I approached the heavy steel door of Lorenzo's cell. I didn't need them to open it, I had the keys. I wanted him to see me as the person who controlled his literal and figurative cages. When the door creaked open, the man sitting on the narrow cot looked nothing like the Don who had once stepped over my fingers on his marble floors. Lorenzo was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his eyes bloodshot. But when he saw me, a twisted, jagged smile broke across his face. "Back to check on your handiwork, Elena," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves on a grave. "Or did you realize that even with a crown, you're still just the girl who knows exactly how I like my coffee?" "I'm the woman who owns the cup, Lorenzo," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And the grounds. And the hand that pours it. You mentioned a mediator. A contract. Tell me who holds the original, and I might move you to a cell with a window." Lorenzo laughed, a hollow, rattling sound. "You think you can buy the truth? You've been a Romanov for 5 minutes. I've been a Volpe for a lifetime. The mediator is someone even your butcher, Victor, is afraid of. You didn't just burn a piece of paper, Elena. You declared war on the system that kept us all alive." I stepped into the small circle of light in the center of the cell, leaning down until I could smell the stale scent of defeat on him. "I didn't declare war on a system, Lorenzo. I destroyed it. The old world is dead. If your mediator wants to come for the debt, tell them to bring a large enough shovel to bury what's left of your name." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me, sharp and desperate. "He's already here, Elena. He was at the gala. He saw you. He saw the queen in the maid's dress, and he's not coming for the money. He's coming for the prize." I froze, the memory of a pair of eyes from the gala, dark, ancient, and filled with a terrifying intelligence, flashing in my mind. There had been one man who hadn't bowed. One man who had watched Victor kneel with a look of mild amusement rather than shock. I walked out of the cell without another word, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the corridor. Victor was waiting for me in the hallway, his face a mask of concern. "He's right, isn't he?" Victor asked. "He thinks he is," I replied, my mind already spinning forward, calculating moves 3 steps ahead. "The mediator isn't a businessman. He's a predator. And he's been watching me since the moment I walked into this city." I looked at Victor, the weight of the Romanov legacy feeling heavier than it ever had before. The revenge was complete, but the survival was just beginning. The Underworld Love Chapters were no longer about reclaiming a past, they were about defending a future from a man who saw the world as a game of chess and me as the most valuable piece on the board. "Double the guards on the perimeter," I commanded. "And Victor, find out everything there is to know about a man named Julian Vane. If he's the one Lorenzo is counting on, I want to know what he fears before he reaches my gates." As I walked back up toward the light of the citadel, I realized that the maid had been safe in her invisibility. The queen, however, was a target that never stopped moving. But as the sun began to break over the horizon, painting the snow in shades of blood and gold, I knew I wouldn't trade the target for the apron ever again. The arrival of Julian Vane was not announced by the scream of tires or the thunder of gunfire, it was heralded by a silence so absolute it felt as though the very birds had fled the citadel's battlements. I was in the courtyard, watching the frost settle on the gray stone, when the heavy iron gate simply drifted open. There was no struggle at the perimeter, no frantic radio calls from the guards. One by one, my men simply stood aside, their faces blank, as a single vintage black sedan rolled to a halt on the gravel. Victor was at my side in a heartbeat, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon, his knuckles white. I could feel the ripple of unease coming from him. A man who had faced death 1,000 times was now trembling at the sight of a closed car door. "He's here," Victor whispered, the words barely more than a breath. "The ghost of the council. He doesn't move for money, Elena. He moves for the debt that can never be repaid." The door opened, and Julian Vane stepped out. He didn't look like a warlord. He was dressed in a charcoal suit of such exquisite tailoring it made the world around him look ragged. He was older than me, perhaps in his late 30s, with silver at his temples and eyes that seemed to have seen the rise and fall of empires without blinking. He didn't carry a gun. He carried a leather briefcase and an aura of such crushing authority that I felt the phantom weight of my maid's apron trying to pull me down. I didn't let it. I stood my ground, the Romanov pin on my lapel catching the pale winter sun. You've entered a sovereign stronghold without an invitation, Mr. Vane. In this city, that is usually a death sentence. Julian smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his cold, analytical eyes. He walked toward me, ignoring the guns that were slowly being raised by the few guards who had regained their senses. He stopped exactly 6 feet away, the distance dictated by ancient etiquette. A sovereign stronghold? Julian's voice was melodic, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. I remember when this stronghold was a nursery, Princess Elena. I remember your father's laughter, and I remember the blood on the snow the night it stopped. You call yourself a queen, yet you sit in a chair built by a man you have locked in a basement. That is not sovereignty. That is a temporary occupation. The Volpes are a stain I am currently scrubbing away, I countered, my voice steady despite the roar of adrenaline in my ears. Lorenzo mentioned a mediator. I assume you are here to collect a debt that no longer exists. Julian opened the briefcase with a soft click. He pulled out a document, but it wasn't the marriage contract I had burned. It was a single sheet of vellum, yellowed with age, bearing a seal that made Victor's breath hitch. The marriage contract was the price for the Volpe's protection, Julian explained, stepping closer. But your father didn't just owe them his life. He owed the council his legacy. This is a deed of guardianship. According to the laws that govern the families you now claim to lead, you are not a queen until the council confirms your bloodline. And until that day, you are a ward of the state. Specifically, my ward. The air left my lungs. The hidden identity I had cherished, the revenge I had executed, it was all a play performed on a stage Julian Vane owned. He wasn't here to save Lorenzo. He was here to claim the prize that Lorenzo had been too stupid to keep. I am a Romanov, I hissed, taking a step toward him, my blue fire clashing with his gray steel. I don't belong to a council, and I certainly don't belong to you. Julian reached out, his fingers catching a loose strand of my hair and tucking it behind my ear with a tenderness that felt like a threat. You belong to the order that keeps the world from burning, Elena. You spent a year as a maid. You should be used to serving a master. The only difference is that I will treat you with the respect your blood deserves, as long as you remember who holds the leash. He turned to Victor, who looked ready to tear him apart. Mr. Carlo, you will find my luggage in the trunk. I shall be staying in the East Wing. Ensure the Queen is ready for dinner at 8. We have much to discuss regarding the future of her city. As Julian walked toward the citadel's entrance, the guards parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He had walked into my fortress and, with a single piece of paper, turned it back into my prison. I stood in the center of the courtyard, the cold wind biting at my skin. I looked at the black car, then at the man disappearing into my home. The battle with the Volpes had been a skirmish. This was the war. Julian Vane didn't want my throne, he wanted the woman sitting on it. I looked at Victor, whose face was a mask of despair. He thinks I'm still the girl in the apron, Victor, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low hum. He thinks he can trade one cage for another. What do we do, Elena? I looked up at the East Wing, where the lights were already being turned on for my new guardian. We do what we've always done. We serve him. We learn his secrets. And when he finally thinks I've been tamed, we show him why the winter never truly ends. I walked back into the citadel, not as a ward, but as a predator who had just found a larger target. The Underworld Love Chapters were about to get a lot more complicated. The dining room of the Citadel, which once felt like a sanctuary of my reclaimed power, had been transformed into a cold stage for a psychological duel. The long oak table was set for two, the silver polished to a mirrored shine that reflected the flickering candlelight like the blades of 100 knives. Julian Vane sat at the head, the seat that was rightfully mine, his presence expanding to fill the room until the shadows themselves seemed to bow to him. I entered slowly, wearing a gown of blood-red silk, the fabric whispering against the stone floor like a warning. I didn't look like a maid, and I didn't feel like a ward. I felt like an assassin. "Punctuality is the politeness of kings," Julian said, standing with a fluid grace as I approached. "And, apparently, of queens who were once servants." "I learned the value of timing while waiting for Lorenzo to turn his back," I replied, taking the seat opposite him. "It's a habit that serves me well in matters of state and survival." The meal was served in a silence so thick it felt physical. Victor stood by the door, his eyes never leaving Julian, his hand hovering near his holster. Julian ignored him entirely, focusing on his wine with the relaxed air of a man who knew he was perfectly safe in a room full of enemies. He took a slow sip, his gray eyes tracking my every movement, analyzing the way I held my fork, the way I breathed, the way I fought to keep my expression a mask of bored indifference. "You're looking for a weakness, Elena," he said suddenly, the bluntness of the statement catching me off guard. "You're wondering if I have a mistress, a secret debt, or perhaps a soft spot for a tragic story. You're trying to find the crack in the armor so you can slip the knife in. Is it working?" I asked, setting my glass down with a soft click. "Not yet. But I admire the effort. Most people in your position would be begging for their lives or plotting a clumsy escape. You, however, are calculating the weight of my soul to see if it's worth the price of a bullet." He leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his ancient eyes. "But here is the truth you haven't realized. I am the only thing standing between you and the families who want your head on a spike. Without the council's seal, you are just a girl with a stolen gun and a very loud mouth." "I am a Romanov," I hissed, the fire in my blood finally reaching my voice. "My blood is the seal. Blood is just red water until it's spilled, Elena. The council requires a demonstration of stability. They want to know if you can lead, or if you will simply burn the city down to satisfy your petty grudges." Julian stood and walked around the table, stopping behind my chair. He leaned down, his voice a low, melodic vibration near my ear. "Lorenzo was a butcher. Marco was a thug. But I am an architect. I can build you a throne that will last a century, or I can turn this citadel into your tomb. The choice, for once, is actually yours." I felt the heat of his presence, the dangerous magnetism that made him 100 times more lethal than Lorenzo could ever hope to be. He wasn't trying to break my spirit, he was trying to colonize it. He wanted to be the hand that guided the queen, the shadow behind the crown. "What is your price, Julian?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one walks into a war zone just to offer architectural advice. Julian's hand brushed the Romanov pin on my shoulder, his touch lingering for a second too long. "I don't want your money, Elena. And I don't want your city. I want the one thing your father promised the council 20 years ago. I want the Romanov archives, the records of every secret, every sin, and every betrayal committed by the families for 3 generations. Your father hid them before he died. Lorenzo searched for them for a decade and found nothing. But you were the maid. You've cleaned every inch of this house. You know where the ghosts are buried. The archives. The black ledger of the underworld. My father had told me about them once, calling them the sovereign's last breath. If Julian got his hands on them, he wouldn't just rule the city, he would own the souls of everyone in it. And if I find them for you? I asked, my mind already weaving a web of its own. Then you get your seal. You get your throne. And I leave your city to grow fat and happy under your rule. He stepped back, his shadow stretching long across the floor. But don't lie to me, Elena. I can hear your heart beating from here. You know exactly where they are, don't you? I looked into his eyes and for the first time, I didn't see a guardian or a mediator. I saw a man who was just as hungry as I was. I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips that made Victor shift uncomfortably by the door. I might know where a few ghosts are hiding, I said, standing up to meet him at eye level. But if I'm going to dig them up, I'm going to need more than a promise of stability. I want Lorenzo Volpe's head. Not in a cell. Not in a cage. I want the debt settled, Julian. Give me the man who treated me like a maid, and I will give you the secrets of the world. Julian studied me for a long moment, a flicker of genuine respect, or perhaps amusement, passing over his features. He extended his hand, his fingers long and elegant. A life for a legacy. A fair trade. You have 48 hours, Elena. After that, the council loses its patience, and I lose my interest in keeping you alive. I didn't take his hand. I simply turned and walked toward the door, the red silk of my gown trailing behind me like a river of blood. As I passed Victor, I didn't look at him, but I felt his silent question. The archives, Your Majesty, he whispered as we reached the hallway. They don't exist, Victor, I replied, my voice a cold, hard diamond. But Julian doesn't know that. He wants a ghost. Then we're going to give him one that will haunt him for the rest of his life. I walked toward my quarters, the weight of the Underworld Love Chapters shifting once again. I had 48 hours to build a lie so perfect it would trap a man who built empires. The maid had learned how to hide things, the queen was about to learn how to bury them. The descent into the bowels of the citadel felt like a journey into the throat of a beast that had been starving for 20 years. The air here was different, colder, heavier, tasting of damp earth and ancient metal. I led the way, a single iron key clutched in my palm, while Julian Vane followed close behind. He didn't carry a flashlight, he moved through the gloom with the uncanny confidence of a man who was already intimate with the dark. Victor brought up the rear, his presence a silent, vibrating tension, his hand never straying from the hilt of his blade. My father always said that the most important things shouldn't be kept in safes, I whispered, my voice echoing off the narrow stone walls. Safes can be cracked. Secrets, however, are best kept where no one wants to look. We reached a heavy, rusted door at the very end of the lowest corridor, far beneath the luxury of the guest suites and the iron bars of the cells. This was the dead zone, a part of the foundation that had been sealed since the Great Purge. I inserted the key into the lock, the sound of grinding tumblers screaming in the silence. With a heavy shove, the door groaned open, revealing a small, circular chamber lined with rotting wooden crates and piles of discarded linens. Julian stepped inside, his nose wrinkling at the scent of mildew. This is it? The black ledger of the underworld is kept among moth-eaten blankets and broken furniture? The archives aren't in the crates, Julian, I said, walking toward the back of the room where a large, ornate mirror hung crookedly against the stone. I caught my reflection, a woman in red, looking like a drop of blood in a tomb. They are behind the one thing a Volpe would never look at, a reminder of their own vanity. I pressed a hidden catch behind the mirror's frame, and the entire stone section behind it swung inward with a pneumatic hiss. Behind it lay a small, velvet-lined alcove containing a single, leather-bound volume and a stack of microfiche. It looked perfect. It looked legendary. It was the most beautiful lie I had ever crafted. Julian pushed past me, his composure finally slipping. His fingers trembled as he reached for the book. He opened the first page, his eyes scanning the lists of names, bank accounts, and dates I had spent the last 12 hours meticulously fabricating with Victor's help. We had used enough real names and low-level secrets to make the bait irresistible. "It's all here," Julian breathed, a terrifying light dawning in his eyes. "The blackmail on the European syndicates, the true owners of the shipping ports, this is more than a ledger. This is a scepter." "It's your price, Julian," I reminded him, my voice a cold, sharp blade. "The archives for my freedom. And for Lorenzo." Julian didn't look up. He was entranced, his mind already calculating how many empires he could topple with the ink on these pages. "You've done well, Elena. Perhaps I underestimated the Maid. You didn't just clean this house, you mapped its soul. And now I'm exorcising it," I replied. I looked at Victor, a silent signal passing between us. "The deal is done. Take the book. Leave my city. And deliver Lorenzo to the courtyard." Julian finally looked at me, and for a split second, I saw something in his gaze that wasn't greed. It was a flicker of suspicion, a shadow of the predator realizing he might be in a trap. He closed the book with a heavy thud. "You're very eager to see me go, Your Majesty. Is it because you fear the council, or because you fear that I might actually be the only one who truly understands you?" "I don't fear you, Julian," I said, stepping closer until our shadows merged in the flickering light of the alcove. "I just find you unnecessary. The underworld doesn't need an architect anymore. It has a queen who knows how to tear down the walls." Julian laughed, a low, melodic sound that chilled me to the bone. He tucked the book under his arm and bowed, a real bow, deep and respectful, though infused with a poisonous irony. "Then I shall take my leave. The council will have their seal. You will have your throne. And Lorenzo, well, Lorenzo will have his justice." He walked out of the chamber, his footsteps fading into the distance as he ascended back toward the light. I stayed in the dark for a long moment, my heart finally beginning to slow. The ledger was a ticking time bomb. Within 48 hours, the fake ink would react with the treated paper, blurring into illegible stains. By the time Julian realized he had been played, he would be halfway across the continent, and I would have moved my forces. "Is it over?" Victor asked, stepping out of the shadows. "No," I said, looking at the empty alcove. "The maid is finished with the cleaning. The queen is finished with the hiding. Now, we go to the courtyard. I have a debt to collect." We emerged from the depths just as the moon reached its zenith. In the center of the courtyard, stripped of his pride and bound in heavy chains, stood Lorenzo Volpe. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. He thought Julian had saved him. He thought the mediator had won. I stood before him, the wind whipping my red gown around my legs like a flame. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at the man who had called me nothing, and saw exactly what he was, a stain that had finally been scrubbed away. "Elena," he croaked, his voice breaking. "The contract, the mediator." "The mediator took the archives and left, Lorenzo," I said, my voice carrying across the silent citadel. "He didn't ask for you. He didn't even mention your name. To him, you were just the dirt on the cover of the book." I looked at the guards, then at the heavy iron gates that were finally, truly, mine. The Underworld Love Chapters had reached their final sentence. "Clean the courtyard," I commanded, turning my back on the man who had destroyed my life. "And ensure there isn't a single speck of dust left when you're finished." As I walked back toward the throne room, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the blood and the stone in a blanket of pure, silent white. The maid was gone. The queen had arrived. And the world was finally, beautifully, cold.